Dream machine. DICOM, HL7, I-18 in the snap. We're building the future, never looking back.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Imaging Informatics Unplugged, where we dive deep into the systems, standards, and stories shaping the future of imaging. Now, today's episode is a special one. If you've spent any amount of time in the world of imaging informatics, especially anything related to DICOM, chances are you've come across the name David Clunie. I still remember when I was starting out in the field, a colleague pointed me to this free tool called DICOM Cleaner on David's website, and I've been following his work ever since. So since then, I've had the opportunity to interact with him at various conferences and IHG calls, and I'm always struck by his clarity, candor, and depth of knowledge. David Clunie is a radiologist by training, but he's now retired from clinical practice, and he's a medical informaticist, but that really just scratches the surface. He's a longtime editor of the DICOM standard, a prolific open source software author, and an essential voice in the imaging standards community. His contributions span DICOM structured reporting, digital pathology, de-identification with tools like DICOM Cleaner, and countless efforts through IHE and the DICOM working groups. Today, David joins us to talk about the journey of DICOM, from its roots in proprietary file formats and 50-pin connectors through its evolution into the global backbone of imaging interoperability. We explore the early battles for standardization, the open source philosophy that helped DICOM thrive, and the future of imaging domains like digital pathology, and yes, that ever elusive idea of DICOM 4.0. So whether you're a developer, a clinician, a vendor, or just curious about how all these systems come together, this episode is packed with insights. And if you're enjoying this podcast, don't forget to like, subscribe, and it'll help other people learn about it. Quick note, this is not a video podcast. This is strictly audio, so there'll be no video of David and I chatting. I hope you enjoy. Let's jump into it. Okay, so here we go. Recording now. Okay, well, welcome, David. Thank you very much for joining me today on Imaging Informatics Unplugged. And today I'm excited about the conversation we're going to have, talking about the DICOM standard. And we were just chatting offline there, and appreciating that you were not around right at the very beginning of this, but I thought maybe you could shed a bit of light, because you've been actually, how long have you been involved with DICOM as a standard?
Since the early 90s. DICOM 3 came out in 1993, I suppose, and I was reviewing some of the material offline, but I didn't really become actively engaged till about 1995 or so.
What drew you? Because you're by trade, you're a radiologist, but I guess what drew you to wanting to be involved in the development and kind of building out a strong standard?
Well, when I was a kid, when I was a teenager, I was a bit of a computer nerd before I went to medical school, and so I liked the technology aspects of things, and that's probably why I became a radiologist in the first place, because CT and MR were kind of coming out, and very early on, I realized that the scanners we had in the hospital, it was very difficult for me to get the images off them, because another aspect of my personality is that I'm a bit of a hoarder and I like to keep things. And so keeping the digital form of the images was challenging. So I became interested in proprietary file formats, if you can believe that. And so when ACR NEMA started and then DICOM, I was interested in purely selfishly in getting hold of the images in various different formats, and having a standard format seemed to me to make sense.
So that's interesting. So we're looking at the early 90s. I from what I've looked up and read, I think 83 is roughly around the first time an official PACS implementation is documented. And so that would have been, like well before, or at least around the time that ACR NEMA were having conversations about what would lead to what we now know as DICOM. In the 90s, what did that look like? You've just kind of alluded that there was a lot of proprietary formats. Imaging solution or a digital solution in the hospital, did it look very siloed? You had, one vendor coming in and proposing a swath of different solutions that would help fix everything, or how did it look when an implementation was put in?
That's absolutely the case. So, for example, when we got our first intravenous digital subtraction angiography system, which I remember being impressed by the technology at the time, it was completely proprietary from end to end. There was, it used probably hard drives from OEMs and stuff that were spec'd to be fairly advanced in order to meet the frame rates and all that kind of stuff. But basically, you bought a modality from a vendor that did what it did very well in most cases, but it didn't connect to anything, and there was no expectation that it would connect to anything until people started to realize that they needed to do that. And you remember that in the early days, all the digital modalities, CT and MR, we printed them to film and then read the film. We never read them off the screen. There was no such thing as soft copy reading. And indeed, it wasn't until Fuji came along with computed radiography that it was practical to have digital X-ray, digital projection X-ray. So there was a confluence of a whole lot of technologies in the 80s and the early 90s that led to it being possible to interoperate, but still not absolutely necessary to interoperate. So fortunately, if you go back and look at the early PACS conferences, like the SPIE PACS conferences and so on, they started out in the early 80s, 1981, 1982. So the PACS 1 conference is kind of a line in the sand where you see academics and government organizations and vendors and standard societies getting together and saying, we can do this, but we need a standard. They even had a whole session on standards in the very first PACS conference. So there was a realization amongst both the suppliers and the consumers of the equipment that standards were really necessary. But it took another, 10 or years or so, another decade or so, before they were actually able to achieve a practical standard. So the original ACR NEMA standard, which came out in 1985, and ACR represented the academic radiologists, and the NEMA represented the manufacturers of the equipment, and the government was kind of behind the scenes in the form of, FDA folks and NIH folks and so on and so forth. But they got together and produced a standard which reflected the thinking of the day, which was very hardware oriented. So even though if you read the ACR NEMA standard from 1985, which we keep online for historical purposes, you can see that they had the same tag value pairs we have today, but in conjunction, there was a 50-pin plug, a physical plug that the standard specified. And each of the pins on that 50-pin plug did something specific. There was a 16-bit parallel data path, which you see reflected in the current standard with its obsession with 16-bit word aligned things and padding to even byte numbers and so on and so forth. And there were electrical specifications for what happened on those pins. And so most of the ACR NEMA 1985 standard was about the hardware and the electrical characteristics of the signals. And there was only a small part which actually listed, the tag names for the data elements that would get transmitted over that. But there were, commands to do things such as, send an image and so on. So it was sort of the beginning part of the whole thing. But you realize, of course, that in the 80s, people didn't have networks.
Yeah.
And so point-to-point connections were logical. So you bought a ultrasound cart, and it had a physical connector on it, out of which you could get stuff maybe. And the ACR NEMA standard was intended for that. Likewise, if you have a CT scanner, you plug it in to this 50-pin thing. That was the idea, and the network aspects of this were envisaged in the so-called network interface unit suggestions, but it wasn't routine to have networks. It wasn't, Ethernet had only barely come into existence. It wasn't clear that Ethernet would dominate. TCP/IP had come into existence through the DARPA efforts to fund research into the internet, but there was still ISO-OSI, which was the sort of the bloated, bureaucratic, theoretical approach to internet working, as opposed to the, more
Yes.
pragmatic, shall we say, TCP/IP, which ended up prevailing. So it wasn't until that had all shaken itself out, TCP/IP was dominant, Ethernet was dominant, everybody was using networks, even on a relatively small scale, and so it became natural to evolve the standards in a direction. And so that's essentially what DICOM 3 became. It was basically ACR NEMA taking the various proprietary variants of ACR NEMA that had evolved over time to meet individual vendor and customers' needs, and sort of married them together into some somewhat bloated, somewhat heavyweight, somewhat OSI reminiscent thing that is what we call DICOM 3 today. And that's one of the reasons why DICOM, the standard, is so hard to read, because it inherits a lot of the the sort of formal terminology from OSI, whereas behind the hood, DICOM is basically pretty simple and really not that different from the 1985 ACR NEMA stuck on top of Ethernet.
So we see the seed of the vision being planted in the early 80s, but the infrastructure is just not there to support the vision. I often see today where if vendors had their own way, like standards sometimes I think get in the way of their, the corporate vision sometimes. And unless customers request things, vendors don't necessarily want to go down the path of implementing standards. I think maybe that's changed a bit now because their interoperability is a key function of an operating solution. Back then, you did mention that the vendors themselves, or like the suppliers, were advocating for this. Were they a strong voice back then, or was there?
It's very difficult to generalize about a vendor. It's sort of like generalizing about a country, or a government, or a region. There are different people inside each vendor organization. And so within a company, like I worked briefly for General Electric in the 90s, and I was hired by somebody who'd been involved in the development of DICOM and in a group that was focused on interoperability. But it was our mission to evangelize both internally as well as externally about interoperability and the need for standards to achieve interoperability of image exchange anyway. But it was a hard sell to the vertical business units who were busy selling CT scanners and MRI scanners and angio machines and so on and so forth, because their primary focus was delivering a machine that worked well for their customers, that did good things like image quality or speed or whatever else it was, and so that was their focus. So interoperability was basically sort of an irritating thing that they were being forced to deal with. But you also realize that in the early 90s, almost nobody had a PACS. So in the early 90s and late 80s, there were meetings you'd go to, like SIM. We were talking about SIM before we started the call, where you'd go to SIM and people would present papers on, the current state of large-scale PACS in the world, and they would describe 3 sites, or maybe next year 7 sites. And by large-scale PACS, they meant anything that involved multiple modalities, essentially, across the entire enterprise of radiology, at least, because enterprise imaging, as we call it today, meant something different. Enterprise imaging in the 90s meant you could see your radiology images somewhere else in the enterprise, as opposed to see another ology. And so as a consequence, there were no customers. So trying to sell a business unit on the need to include a feature that would affect, 1%, not even 10% of their customer base was a very hard sell. And particularly when it involved cooperating with your competitors, because the key to interoperability is not just standardization, but it's also testing. So not only did you have to build in DICOM capability, for argument's sake, but you then had to test it with somebody you hated if you were a salesperson. Engineering people tend to get along regardless of which company they're working for, but it's a salesperson's job to compete with the competitor. So this notion of interoperability as a means to interact with your competitor was a hard sell. The other thing that was hard is that those vendors who were interested in PACS as a product and who were motivated to do things like, bid on major government contracts or major military contracts like the DIN PACS contract or the old MDIS PACS or whatever, They were in the business of selling monolithic solutions.
Yes. Yeah.
The Vienna PACS, for example, was not on, was a hospital that was built with a Siemens, just to name one vendor of the day, PACS that worked with Siemens modalities, and so. Internally, as it happens, in order for their modalities to communicate with each other, they were using lots and bits and pieces of ACR NEMA. And Siemens and Philips got together and had a thing called SPI, which was Siemens Philips Interconnect, or Standard Product Interconnect was the outward-facing name of that. But it built upon the standards. It addressed networking, but it was done inside a pair of companies who were working on essentially monolithic PACS. But over time, fortunately, or whatever, it became clear that customers didn't want to buy everything from one company, that they still wanted the choice of which CT scanner they wanted or which MR scanner they wanted, regardless of whose PACS they wanted. And there was also a whole bunch of people who developed third-party applications to kind of glue stuff together, the old days of Merge and Desjardins boxes to connect things together, and people who were interested in providing PACS alone as a product. And so that whole industry eventually sorted itself out, and there were so many players involved and so many luminary academic institutions that had strong purchasing power, that for whatever reason, it just all worked out nicely in the end, that they all agreed to use DICOM. DICOM evolved into whatever it is, and for better or for worse, it became the standard. It's sort of like the beta VHS wars with respect to videotape formats. It wasn't necessarily the best one that won out in the end in terms of technological features or whatever, but everybody agreed to do one thing one way. And even if it wasn't the perfect way, it was a sufficient way to meet the needs of the industry. And the same, I think, is true of DICOM.
I guess it was open as well, which is were some of these competing standards, were they closed, or was there
that's huge. That's huge. That is probably related to the two main reasons for its success. One, it was open so that anybody could read it. It wasn't necessarily free to actually physically buy it back in the day when people had paper printed standards and stuff, but it was available to everybody. There were no license fees to use it, and there have been some successful standards like MPEG, for TV video, that has a licensing consortium attached to it and fundamental patents involved to enforce that. But people in the 80s were into this notion of openness and open standards, at least in terms of something that was openly documented that people could implement independently. So that's what open standards meant back in the day, I guess. And the governments were very, very big on that too. I mean, that's why OSI from ISO came into existence. It's Open Standards Initiative is the name of it, built into the name. And DICOM was open. It was industrially developed rather than by a formal standards organization like ISO or ANSI or whatever. It was international because it had players from Europe, both in terms of academics and consultants as well as companies, which was very important. And DICOM remains international to this day, even though our staff organization and secretariat is US based. Yeah, and we remain independent. We remain independent of all those formal standards organization deliberately. So we think that's very important.
Remain independent, but maybe I guess you could speak to, there is a relationship where the UIDs are governed by is ISO or ANSI.
No, actually, they're not actually governed by anybody. It's just a standard for how to make them unique. And before the days of cryptographic UUIDs like we would use today, perhaps in a new standard, it was necessary to have a kind of hierarchical approach to uniqueness. And so the UID roots from which you build your own UIDs, just like the domain name service, need to be hierarchical, which means somebody needs to be in control at the top. So ISO took on the responsibility for that. ISO wrote the standard for that, 7498 or whatever it is. And they just partition up the space below them. So it's just like the domain name service. If you want to go to, Network Solutions or GoDaddy or whoever it is you go to get your domain name, they are beholden to their parent who issues their root, who is beholden in turn to somebody above them. So it's just the nature of hierarchical issuing of uniqueness that's the only thing. And in some countries, if you want to use an ANSI specified UID directly from ANSI, you have to pay ANSI to give you the rights to use the next thing down, just like you have to pay for your domain from Network Solutions or whoever. And in other countries, they say, no, we're just going to give it away. And then in other situations, somebody has come up with a need for a sort of mechanized way of issuing UIDs that they paid once to get their root, and now they automate the issuance of things below that without charging for it. So there's all sorts of ways to get UID roots if you need them. And nowadays we have the 2.25 solution for using a cryptographically generated UUID as a UID reversibly. Sorry, too much detail getting into the weeds, but
No, the weeds are great here. This is good. To take a step back, you mentioned, I think that was a really good point about you can't generalize vendors. Under one roof, there's a lot of different ways of looking at things. If you walk down the hallway of RSNA or SIM, it's a very competitive spirit between booths. But if you're fortunate enough to attend a Connectathon, it's a very different feeling when you have two different vendors working together on proving that a profile is going to be successful or not.
Absolutely, yeah. That's really the key is cooperation between the grunt level engineers, the minions, foot soldiers working on actually making it happen, as well as their management, be it engineering management or whatever, who recognize the importance of doing this and spending a not inconsiderable amount of money to send a team to a Connectathon somewhere and prepare for it and so on and so forth. So it's a significant investment. It might seem trivial in the face of things, but when you're buying a $10 million MRI scanner, the amount of money you spent on connectivity is pretty trivial. But it's still finite, and it's a resource that you have to commit to, and not everybody can do that. Not all small companies can do that, and that's why a lot of small companies find it challenging to get off square one. And that's where the tools come in. And that was the other key to the success of DICOM, I think, is some of the people at the beginning, and I won't name names because my history might be inaccurate, recognized that not only did they need to have an open standard, but they had to have open source implementations, reference implementations available for people to work with, both to test their own implementation as they were just starting, or to build their own implementation on top of as it was starting, just like TCP/IP, and Ethernet and stuff like that. You needed that sort of kickstarting. Same with JPEG. If Tom Lane hadn't written the independent JPEG groups codec and released it open source, there'd be no JPEG. Nobody would be using it for a range of different reasons. So that openness, not just of the standard, but of a reference or open source implementation that you can reuse, was huge. And that meant that people had the tools to do simple things like send a file or dump a header or whatever else it was. And remarkably, the first central test node that Steve Moore was responsible for writing, they wrote that in like a couple of months once they were given the go ahead. So it's and the availability of that was the other huge thing. And I think that's a lesson for all the standards that we can learn from all the standards that have been successful. Same applies to web browsers, web servers, and so on and so forth. Just operating systems, even having Linux, having Apache, having all of those things, having NCSA, Mosaic back in the beginning of the web, and so on. DICOM followed the same path on a much smaller scale, of course, but that helped tremendously too. And that also applies going forward. If we add something new that's, shall we say, ambitious with respect to the current standard, it's really nice to have an open or reference implementation. We don't require it, but it helps a lot.
So I'm curious, do you see things that seem familiar now? Where digital pathology, for example, has been talked about for close to a decade at least, like as far as real implementations, and we see this in radiology, DICOM is just ubiquitous. We take it for granted. It's there, just like we breathe air. But then when we start entering into some of these new imaging domains, there's it tends to be a lot more resistance, and maybe it's a lack of understanding of the value of interoperability. Do you see similarities of that kind of resistance that we see today with the early days of getting people on board to appreciate the value of DICOM in the radiology space?
Absolutely. And I'm somewhat biased because I work actively in the digital pathology space, both as an open source developer, from a standardization perspective, as well as in various different contracts. So to some extent, I have a bit of a conflict of interest in terms of promoting DICOM for whole slide imaging. But the bottom line is that it's exactly the same as I imagine it was in the early 80s. So, pathology is basically between 40 and 50 years behind radiology. And it's not the pathologist's fault, of course, because it's, the technology didn't exist. We're pushing the limits of the optical resolution of the equipment. The use case is not as clear for pathology as it is for radiology. Now that we're all obsessed with machine learning and artificial intelligence, there's a whole bunch of new computational pathology, as they call it, use cases for digitization that perhaps didn't exist. But pathologists are pretty comfortable with their microscopes, just like radiologists once upon a time were pretty comfortable with their film. So they're going through the same growing pains, and the market hasn't developed to the point where every hospital in the world looks at the concept of a microscope as being ludicrous and says, why aren't you digital? It's not how it is. It's the exact opposite. They look at the huge cost of implementing digital pathology, particularly with respect to storage, because these images are fairly large. And they say, show us the business case. And the same was true with PACS. In the mid-90s, early 2000s even, there were still, hospitals looking at it and saying, your business case doesn't make sense. You tell me it's obvious. You tell me we have to do this, but how is this going to make me more money or lose me less money? If depending on how you're funded, how your business model works. And the same is true in pathology. So I don't think pathology has hit that tipping point, if you want to use that expression, where digital pathology for whole slide imaging is a no-brainer, to use another expression. And so until it does, there will always be a sorting out phase. So in pathology, in digital pathology, both for anatomic pathology, slides of tissue specimens, as well as hematology and bone marrow aspirates and microbiology and all of the other, microscope-based activities, shall we say. They all have to deal with this. They all have to deal with the technological peculiarities, and in hematology and cytology and frozen sections and paraffin formalin fixed sections. They're all a bit different, so there's different technologies have to be married together. The standard has to cope with them all. The necessary bits and pieces in the middle need to deal with each other. The regulators have to get their head around this, and still in the United States, the FDA requires the end-to-end pixel pathway to be approved or cleared through various creative mechanisms, admittedly, but still, you have to go all the way from the scanning device to the monitor, and they don't allow you to mix and match in the middle unless it's a pre-cleared combination. So it's sort of like mammography was for a while. So there are all sorts of barriers to the business case for interoperability.
And I guess
that. Go ahead.
No, finish your thought, and then I'll ask my question.
Yeah, and so that leads people to feel comfortable with a monolithic solution. If they're going to be forced to choose something from a vendor or consortia of vendors that is cleared, that is the responsibility is all taken care of, then that they're happy to buy from one vendor. But then when they want to add in a computational pathology AI solution that doesn't work with that vendor, they're kind of screwed. So they understand that there's benefit from interoperability. They haven't yet, I don't think, bought into the notion that they can leverage their enterprise infrastructure to help them. They still want to have a pathology-specific archive. They still want to have a pathology-specific image management system, even though they may have a enterprise-wide EMR or EHR that has a anatomical pathology laboratory information system module, they may still have bought that from another vendor. They still are not on board with this notion of leveraging as much of the infrastructure for storage, for disaster recovery, business continuity, for security, and so on and so forth. And until they do, they won't really realize the benefits of many of these standards. But fortunately, on the other hand, we have these connectathons. We demonstrate it's feasible to scan with one vendor, archive with another vendor, display with a third vendor, using DICOM in the middle and DICOM Web, and particularly for the display connecting side. And that's sort of where we're at now. 30 to 40 years behind radiology, but they have the potential to catch up very quickly if they focus on leveraging the standards we have.
What are your thoughts around in radiology? There was a good part of the business case was you got to reclaim a lot of real estate in the hospital. The film library would go away. You could potentially reallocate resources, or potentially lay people off if need be, that were previously doing like film-based librarian work, and now moving towards a digital environment. That's no longer needed. In digital path, that's not necessarily the case, because there's different requirements around keeping the slide. I believe I was talking to Jung-Soo from Samsung Medical Center in South Korea, and he was mentioning that I think they can retain it for 5 years, and after 5 years they can destroy it. Not many regions around the world have that low of a threshold of keeping it. What are your thoughts around kind of that as a hindrance for the overall business case?
I don't think it's really so much a hindrance. It's true that for digital pathology at the moment, you still need to keep your slides, you still need to keep your tissue. But remember, there are many reasons for keeping your tissue and your slides beyond just the images. So in radiology with film, of course, the film had no inherent value in it. So if the radiology digital copy had high fidelity, then the film was worthless, if there even was a film, if you didn't print it in the first place, if it came from a CT scanner. But with pathology, it's different, though. So, for example, you have a slide. You can clear that slide and restain it with something and gain new information. You can take that tissue block and you can cut it again and do different stains. So there's a whole bunch of factors involved where the digital image is not necessarily the substitute for the tissue or the slide. Similarly, you might want to send stuff somewhere else. There's an advantage to sending the digital image because that's extremely low cost and very fast, instantaneous. Whereas sending a physical slide or sending the tissue involves a lot more effort and a lot more time. However, the recipient might be able to do more with it when they get it. So it's a different paradigm. It's not just about replacing a film room with a digital archive as it essentially was in radiology. Also, the original cost models for radiology packs weren't necessarily borne out in the sense that you took your X dollar per hour film clerk and replaced them with a 10X dollar per hour PhD medical physicist or something like that, or engineer of some kind. So it's not necessarily a simple trade-off like that. And I don't pretend to be to understand the business models. I think what we should focus on is the features that are enabled. So to the extent that in digital pathology, having an interoperable digital pathology solution allows you to bring to bear computational tools, whether they be AI-based or classical image processing or any other kind of tool, that allows you to do things that you couldn't do with slides. And there are still things for which slides are better. There are certain things that you can't see with the current digital technology, and if you need to be able to see them, you still need to keep your microscope. So it's a nascent technology, it's a nascent business, and it'll be interesting to see how it works out. But since every single facet of interaction in medicine has gone digital, apart from pathology pretty much. It's sort of like the old packs that, I'm filmless except for mammography. Well, we got over that. And I dare say enterprises in future will say, we're physical asset less apart from pathology in some narrow use cases, but we'll get there eventually. The other thing, of course, is there are new technologies that don't involve slides, that scan tissue directly, that don't involve stains, and so on and so forth. There are all sorts of aspects of pathology beyond the traditional bright field H&E stain slide. That may completely change the paradigm. So we'll see how that works out. Those are mostly characterized by their even larger size. So just as you might double the size of or triple the size of the archive you need to go digital with pathology in your enterprise, some of the new technologies you may be going up an order of magnitude, several orders of magnitude, and that has implications not only for the technology but also for the standards.
So if we were to digress a bit back to you first getting involved in DICOM, so this would have been early days of DICOM 3.0, and we're looking at maybe 25, 30 years later, we're still at DICOM 3.0. How significant of a difference was 1.0 to 2.0, 2.0 to 3.0? Because we've seen a lot of changes occur and updates happen in 3.0. But they're treated as this continuous update as opposed to a version change. So why the kind of the difference in approach compared to what was done in those prior versions?
Well, the so-called 3.0 standard was a transition point in terms of some fundamentals. So it introduced a mechanism that specified the network transport protocol, as well as the format of the data, or file, if you want to call it that. But the file format, in terms of the way it's structured for parsing the headers, has remained fixed since then. So I can take a DICOM 3.0 file, if I'd captured it off the network, and parse it. And if it came from a 1993 device, it still works with my 2025 software. I can still read it. And for those original modalities, CT, MR, computer radiography, and so on and so forth, not only that, but nothing else has changed in the header except for a few additional attributes. So a CT image from today's scanner is exactly the same as a CT image from the 1993 scanner, except that it might have a few more data elements which are optional. And so that could not be said for things that predated 3.0, because even though they may have been very DICOM-like in terms of the way the header was encoded, it was subject to the conventions of the vendor who implemented it. So it's true that I can read an old, Philips or Siemens, IMA file from a 1987 scanner, for argument's sake, because I've instrumented my tools that read DICOM to also handle DICOM-like stuff in earlier ACR NEMA file formats, but that doesn't happen in the clinical world. So there is no use of the old ACR NEMA 1.0, 2.0 standards, 85, 88 standards in the real world. It's all now DICOM 3 or post-DICOM 3. Now, the thing that has changed is that we've added progressively more information objects, which are sort of the unit of conformance of DICOM 3. So DICOM 3 introduced a couple of concepts: network protocol, the concept of a SOP instance, an information model with UIDs for each of the entities, patient study series, hierarchy, that sort of stuff. And various different transfer syntaxes which allowed for different encodings. But if you put the transfer syntaxes aside for a moment, basically, as I say, a CT or MR object from those days is exactly the same, except there's a few more attributes in there. But for a modality like, optical coherence tomography, OCT, for whatever clinical application, there was no object. You would have had to encode them as if they were a CT or as if they were a secondary capture object or whatever. So we've progressively added new information objects, which correspond to subclasses, for new applications. And whole slide imaging is a case in point. So in the mid-90s or late 90s or so, the visible light objects were added, including just slide microscopy, which is basically a photograph down the lens of a optical microscope, stick a video camera or a still camera on top of a microscope, but it wasn't a whole slide. And so when whole slide imaging came along, it was so big and needed to do the sort of Microsoft Terra server, Google Maps type zoom in and out quickly type thing. The idea of tiled pyramids was brought in. So while whole slide imaging is just another DICOM object like any other DICOM object, if you look at it in a radiology viewer, it doesn't look like a slide. So you need the tiled pyramid paradigm. So we do that very, very rarely. So,
and is that around the time where we would have seen the introduction of Working Group 26?
Yes, Working Group 26 started up around the late 2008 timeframe, 2007, 2008, and it produced its work product in 2010, I think. And that's when the revised specimen description object, Supplement 122, came out, and the whole slide imaging tiled pyramid came out, which was Supplement 145. And so that was the substrate for building digital pathology solutions on top of DICOM. That's where that came from. And as you understand, that's a decade and a half ago. So we're still doing basically the same thing with whole slide imaging as we were then. We've tweaked it a bit to incorporate lessons learned, but basically the 2010 solution is what we're using today for that.
Last year, there was some talk about DICOM moving to a 4.0, and there was a lot of discussion, and maybe you could shed some light around
I would love
trying to
yes.
attack, and why was it decided to kind of put a pause on that for now?
So there's one thing that we haven't talked about, which or I've only briefly alluded to, which made a big difference to the way DICOM is used in the real world now, and that's DICOM Web, as we call it, or WADU RS. So way back when, there were various people who played with images who believed we should better leverage consumer industry standards like HTTP and XML and so on and so forth. And so every now and then we bump up against you're not using the latest greatest standard that's used by not only consumers but other verticals. And so XML was a case in point, for example. So they said, well, you introduced structured reporting, why isn't it XML? And we had a whole bunch of arguments for why it wasn't XML, and then we all went around and behind the scenes used XML for lots of things, and then turned it into DICOM SR as we needed it. Same with HTTP. But very early on, as a sort of experiment, one group out of ISO created the WADU standard, Web Access to DICOM Objects or DICOM Persistent Objects or something along those lines, which was basically give me a URL, HTTP URL, and the server will respond to that either with the DICOM object, that is the URL reference, or a JPEG that is, a JPEG of that windowed CT image that is at that URL or whatever. And that turned out to be surprisingly useful. And people started implementing that in interoperable ways. So building upon that, we ended up with this so-called DICOM Web solution, which is a more RESTful, if you believe in RESTful services, Fielding's concept of what a resource is identified by a URL. And so the so-called WADU RS and Keto RS and STO RS services under the DICOM Web umbrella have proven to be very useful for selected use cases. And so the DICOM based digital pathology whole slide imaging solution where the viewer is talking to an archive is totally based on DICOM Web. So we use the frame level retrieval to do the zoom and pan and get JPEG tiles and all that kind of stuff, and basically do Google Maps with whole slide images, and it's mediated by DICOM Web. So DICOM Web provides access both to the pixel data in terms of frame level access if you want it, and also the metadata. So the metadata can be encoded in either the original DICOM file, you can just get the DICOM file if you want, or you can get a XML representation of the DICOM header, which we defined with the old application hosting API some time back, which was never adopted, or you can get it in JSON format. And of course, nowadays, everybody who's a newbie to the field says, well, who would use XML when you can use JSON? So JSON is the greatest thing since sliced bread, apparently, to some people. So we have a way to get the DICOM header in JSON. Unfortunately, the choices made in the way in which that JSON file is encoded are unattractive in many respects to some people implementing some use cases. So because we've kind of opened the door to new APIs, if you want to call them that, including JSON metadata access, people have said, well, hey, we could reorganize all this metadata, we could encode it differently, and we could call it different things, and that would be better for my viewer use case, for argument's sake. And we say, yeah, but that's yet another API, and therefore that reduces interoperability because your new API won't talk to servers that implement the old API, and so on and so forth. So we have this kind of tension. My DICOM network implementation using DMZ services, the old DICOM services, will talk to Steve Moore's 1992 central test node because the protocol has not changed one iota since 1992. It's remained completely stable. And this backwards compatibility is extremely important to the stability of DICOM. On the other hand, it mitigates against improved performance, however you quantify performance for certain use cases, be they network transfer, size of objects, readability of the DICOM header, which is not readable if it's in binary form, obviously, and so on and so forth. So there's a whole bunch of people on both sides of this equation who recognize the need for backward compatibility, however you define that, with the need for innovation and optimization of new use cases, or even optimization of existing use cases where people regard something as underperforming by some criteria. So this tension led to the possibility of doing DICOM 4, which might involve different encoding mechanisms, different network protocol access mechanisms, different scalability mechanisms to deal with objects that were, 1, 2, 3, or more orders of magnitude greater than the size of objects we have now to be future-proofed. Didn't have size limitations on things that were somewhat arbitrary, like 16-bit length fields and that kind of stuff. All of these are possibilities. So, all of the pet peeves of everybody who's ever had to do any coding of DICOM were exposed in this discussion, and then solutions were proposed at a very high level. And then it was all weighed up against this backward compatibility issue and what it would mean to have an installed base of hundreds of millions of DICOM images out there in the archives around the world right now, with tens or hundreds of thousands of DICOM 3 devices out there in the world right now, and who would actually benefit from this? Or would we fall victim to what Fred Brooks, Mythical Man Month guy, called the second system syndrome, where everybody agrees to re-implement something and it takes 10 times as long, is 10 times as big, costs 10 times as much, and still doesn't work and gets canceled at the last minute. So we then looked at the resources we had to work. And so as you may know from having been involved in DICOM and IT activities yourself, we are resource constrained. There's a limit to how much we can do because there aren't that many engineers working on the problem because the companies that supply those people, have limited resources and better things to do with the rest of their money. So could anybody afford to do a completely new implementation of DICOM, or something that was even an incremental improvement, but significant enough to be worth doing at all? And then we weighed that against the possibility of other alternatives. Like some people said, well, maybe we should just open source it and have like a bunch of outsiders do what they need to do to make an improvement. And that turned out to be not a very attractive idea that was likely to lead to a realistic and maintainable solution. So for all those reasons, we decided that the pain and the risk wasn't worth the win. And so it was arguably put on hold. And now we're back to the situation that we were in before all this started, which is essentially people whining about limitations of DICOM 3, wanting to do something different and incompatible, and us having to fight a rearguard action against them or find some compromise that allows us to make a small incremental improvement that doesn't significantly undermine interoperability and has some sort of dynamic fallback path. One thing we do in DICOM to try to mitigate this sort of thing is we say, here's a new way to do something, but if you negotiate on the network such that you determine that the other end can't do this, then you fall back to some compromise. And we did that, for example, with the digital X-ray object. You could fall back to computed radiography if you had to, and stuff like that. And we actually, when I was with GE, we actually implemented it that way. So our digital X-ray product would actually interoperate with the old archives that couldn't handle the newly defined object, and so on and so forth. So sometimes you can manage to do that sort of thing, but it involves more engineering work on both sides to make that sort of thing stable. But occasionally, over time, we gradually introduce new things that are a success, like the digital X-ray object was a great success. The mammography object was a huge success, as was the mammography CAD object. Whereas then we have other new things that are a complete failure, like the enhanced multi-frame MR that we spent a lot of time on, hardly ever implemented, total failure. The second generation radiotherapy objects that the radiotherapy and working groups spent huge amounts of time, literally hundreds of man years of efforts. Nobody wants to implement it. They're now turning around and trying to retrofit some of their concepts to the old first gen RT stuff from the 90s. So it's really, really hard to get vendors and customers to pay for new ways to do the same thing again, which sort of makes sense on the face of it.
Interesting. Would you predict the future is for, these desires probably aren't going to go away anytime soon. So,
well, I think I've lived through, in terms of my DICOM life, I've lived through a number of major generational changes with respect to technology, underlying as well as standards based. So, we went through Corba, we went through DICOM, we went through whatever else, and now we're going through, a pretense at RESTful services mediated by things like JSON. And I imagine in 10 years we'll be talking about, the world beyond JSON, the world beyond HTTP. The consumer industries will provide capabilities that are sufficiently worthwhile to switch to, that we will then retrofit to DICOM as we need to. We definitely need to address the scalability of image size, bulk data size over time. But the same was true when we did, multi-detector CT came in. I lived through that. And, initially the archives couldn't handle it because there was just too much data. And then we built bigger archives, and standard remained the same. Same's true with dual energy CT. We could do it a new way, but the vendors wanted to do retrofit of multi-energy CT onto the existing CT object, and that's what they've done. And I don't hear customers complaining. So I think the key thing to remain in mind is who our customers are for DICOM, if we want to use that expression translated from the business world. Our customers are the users, the physicians, the nurses, the paramedics, whoever else it is. And as long as their devices work, what happens behind the scenes is largely irrelevant. People would love to leverage a huge pool of semi-technologically literate developers who can read a JSON file to do simple things with simple scripts, and that's a cool capability to have, but that's mediated by some of the toolkits. So the AI guys right now are obsessed with Python as their mediation between themselves and the data. So fine, let's use Python. There are Python DICOM toolkits. You don't need to throw away all the metadata and turn it into a nifty array or a NumPy array just to be able to feed your AI pipeline. It's all about the tools. And as long as we can provide the necessary tools to keep the under the hood implementation away from the customer and the customer's agents in terms of low cost semi-literate engineers, I think we're good.
Interesting. So I try to keep these around the 20-30 minute mark. I think we've gone a little over that. Maybe I'll give you an opportunity to close out with kind of just some thoughts around where you, like anything around. We've touched on this about looking towards the future, but maybe if you want to just kind of like reflect on where we've been and where we're going a bit, and I always appreciate kind of your thoughts about bringing this back to the journey that we've taken in this, and it really is a sturdy standard as far as what we've seen in other industries and so on. So I'll give you some opportunity to close out with some comments here.
Yeah, I think it's been a remarkable journey. I'm sure nobody at the beginning of this would have predicted that the size of the installed base would become so large, that DICOM would look basically the same now as it did in the 1980s. They probably would have hoped that the standard wouldn't have expanded from a few hundred pages to, many thousands of pages, if not pushing the 10,000 page mark. I would hope that in the future we will make it more comprehensible and approachable to allow people to participate much more. There's a huge number of people who have a technological literacy that they've inherited from the consumer-oriented world that we could bring to bear on some of these problems. And I think the AI enthusiasm is emphasizing that. There's still a huge gap between the world of the researcher developing AI algorithms or playing with them and actually deploying clinical products that are approved and safe and actually beneficial. Not everything that's approved is necessarily beneficial. But we're getting there. I think DICOM mediates that, DICOM in its current form. I think it will incrementally improve rather than revolutionarily improve or be replaced by something else. But to the extent that we can, I hope that we're not too intractable about working with other standards groups, being recognized by them, leveraging their other features and capabilities. So I still think there's, a good 20, 30, maybe even 50 years left in the standard before it needs to be replaced. So hopefully I'll live that long.
Awesome. Thank you very much, David. I really appreciate you taking the time today, and all the best.
Great. Well, thanks for inviting me.
The Dream Machine. DICOM, HL7, IHE, and Snap. We're building the future, never looking back.